just going to start by thanking everybody for making the time to join us for our fifth Politics of Economics in the time of COVID-19 webinar. So I think the first thing I just want to say is just this quick reminder that it would be great if people could keep their videos off and their microphones on mute, because that does help running things a little bit. So today we are delighted to be hosting a distinguished guest, Jens van Klooster from KU Leuven, in conversation with Raf Danna from the University of Cambridge, and also the Politics of Economics organizing team. So it's a real delight to have both of them together. And before kind of kicking off with our topic, I just want to run through a little bit more housekeeping about how we're going to run the session and a couple of things to keep in mind. The one is that for those of you who are just joining, the session is being recorded. And as previous events, we're going to host this recording on the CRASSH website in due course. You're also all invited to post questions and comments that we can address through the Q&A. And the way we're going to be doing that is for those of you joining through Zoom, you can use the chat box, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with where that is, but just in case, you can find it by looking at the lower end of your screen. And this event is also being live streamed through YouTube. So we invite comments through the YouTube comment box, but also through Twitter. So you can, we're also taking questions at the hashtag PolEconCovid-19, or directly tagging at PolEconCrash, which is the organizing team's Twitter handle. So Jens and Raf are going to have a conversation that will last approximately 35-40 minutes, and then I'll be taking the Q&A at the end. We aim to finish in an hour. We have been running a bit late, so keep that in mind. But we'll see where we're at in terms of questions and at that time. So now's the point that we can launch a little poll, because one of the things that these webinars has allowed us to do is sort of increase our reach and scope, and that allows us to see where people are listening from. And if you can just take a moment to fill that in, it will help us get a sense of where you're listening from, what gender you identify with, and then a kind of trick question about the topic today. So yeah, if all participants could just spend a second doing that, it doesn't take more than a second. And in the meantime, I'll just say, we just want to say our big thanks to all of the supporters of the Politics of Economics webinar series and seminar series, and in particular, CRASSH, and especially Nikki Dardowski for all her help. So you might want to check out some of the events on that website, including a blogged conference that Cleo Chasonnery Zaigouche, who's also part of the organizing team, is part of. So we'll close the poll. Let's share the results. And I guess everybody can see that. So most of the people are tuning in from Europe, but not everybody. Most of our audience is male, which is been the case in all seminars so far, webinars. And everybody thinks the EU will survive the crisis. So without further ado, a little bit about Jens, our invited speaker. Jens received his PhD from Cambridge and is now an FWO postdoc fellow at the KU Leuven University, and also a member of the research group at University of Amsterdam on a normative framework for financial debt. He's working on a book project which promises a lot on the history of financial risk management at the ECB. And I do also just want to plug his award-winning article, The Ethics of Delegating Monetary Policy, along with another one that promises a lot that's forthcoming on the myth of market neutrality, looking at the ECB. So he will be accompanied by Raf Danna, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Cambridge and a co-convener of Politics of Economics. So thank you both, and I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Nikki, for taking care of all the technical sides of this thing, and of course, thanks Jens for being here with us today. I would like to say that well, Jens and I have discussions about these topics quite often, and so we thought that I could have been the person kind of, you know, dealing with him today, we could say. But I would also like to say that this is not exactly my specialism. So my job will mainly be that of giving a sort of a very general introduction and then asking questions to Jens. So I would just like to to start off by reminding everyone how the world we live in has changed dramatically in an extremely short time. It seems we are talking about geological eras away, but in February, European leaders were still arguing on adjusting the adjustment of fractions of percentage points over the next European budget. But then what happened is that in a place quite close to where I was born and grew up, in Codogno in Italy, on the 20th of February of 2020, a doctor decided not to follow the protocols that she was given, and she decided to test a patient with a strange pneumonia for COVID-19. And that was the first patient that's tested positive in Italy. And that event changed completely the world around. So just to go very briefly over the events that followed that discovery. Well, of course, a sequence of lockdowns happened throughout Europe in different stages, but in the end, it happened almost everywhere in Europe. On March 18th, the ECB announced its Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, the PEPP, and the scale of operations of both the ECB and the Federal Reserve in the US have been huge ever since. The politics moved in different ways, and for a pretty long time, we had an interesting sort of French, Italian, Spanish-led coalition that was arguing for some kind of instrument of debt mutualization against a kind of a more familiar, instead, Dutch, Austrian, German coalition. So these are things that were happening within 1 month. Then at the end of May, or around the middle of May, on the 18th of May, France, the Franco-German axis moved back together, and both Macron and Merkel came up with a conference saying that they were backing a 5 billion recovery plan to address, of course, the economic downturn. And then very recently, on May the 27th, the Commission presented to the European Parliament its recovery plan that, well, of course, it is on paper still, but it looks like a dramatic intervention. The scale we are talking about are 5 billion euros in grants and 250 billion in loans. And during this presentation, the President of the European Commission has made clear that the long-term survival of the EU depends on how the Union will respond to this crisis. Of course, these are still all things that are open. This proposal will have to be discussed and approved by all European governments, but this is just an introduction to sort of remind ourselves how quickly both the technocratic and the political landscape has changed as a response of these events that came up in February. So this is my very, very brief introduction, sort of a recap for everyone. And now I will pass the ball. Start off by asking him, why did you decide to start to call this discussion as the EU's technocratic crisis management. Why do you think focusing on the technocratic aspect of all this story is very important?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that introduction, Raf, and thanks for inviting me. Well, so one reason to take this angle, right? So I come from a political philosophy, political economy background, and I've written a lot on central banks. But of course, last week we already talked a lot about central banks, and I think in many ways, really the action at the moment is on the EU level, right? There's a lot of things shifting in the EU, and I thought it would be interesting to talk more about that. Also, because I thought a lot of really interesting things came out of the discussion last week. So yes, so in what sense is the EU technocratic institution? And I think that's really the right way to look at it, and that might also already give you an idea of my not super federalist, broadly intergovernmentalist sympathies in relation to the EU. So I think what's really special about the EU as a sort of political institution is that all the democratic action is really on the level of the member states, right? And I think that also makes sense. That's where you have institutions of over decades old, where you have a media landscape, and maybe we can go into that in a bit more detail, the language, right? So just if you really think seriously about the option of moving to an EU democracy, you would immediately disenfranchise half the population, and in certain segments in some member states, over 90% of the population, just from not having access to these debates if they were taking place in English, right? So I'm broadly, I think this is the right way for the EU to develop, where a lot of the democratic action happens on the member state level, but then at the same time, and I'm Dutch a citizen, right? And it's not been very pretty the past weeks to see that the very messy discussion developing on a sort of EU level, but with domestic politician really speaking to a domestic audience, right? And there's also not so much to gain for many domestic actors, because primarily they are not making EU level policy, so they don't feel a particularly strong incentive to defend it, right? And they're really accountable to their domestic citizens, right? So in this setup, you see, on the one hand, I think something that's very interesting about the EU, right? That you keep these member states, and on the other hand, try to build something on top of that, right? The technocratic EU, and I think that's also something you really need, and there's a tension there, right? Now, why do you need that specifically for the internal market, right? So you have this big market, and that brings a lot of benefits, but you also need ways to regulate this. And then there, with my more economics interest, I also see, yes, you need some kinds of fiscal instrument on that EU level, and that certainly wasn't there before the crisis, right? As you already said, the fighting about 0.1% of the EU GDP, right? And then Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, he showed up to the meeting on making that 0.1% happen with a biography of Frédéric Chopin, telling his colleagues, and of course, particularly also the Dutch audience at home, that he brought the biography because he didn't think this meeting made any sense, and he was just going to wait it out because the Dutch wouldn't want to pay in. And I think they're so quite short-sighted idea of how to move forward with EU politics. So that's sort of I thought why it would be interesting to bring in this technocratic angle, right? So on the one hand, I think there is something about this project of making the EU technocratic, right, and making the member states democratic that's worth maintaining. And then there is also a a number of events at the moment shifting the EU towards a more federal level, more fiscal policy that I also see the importance of, and I thought we can just take it from there.
Yeah, and so like focusing on this technocratic level, would you like to say a bit, kind of give a landscape of what has happened on the technocratic level? Because after all national level lockdowns, a first wave of response came from the technocratic level, which was probably the quickest one to react, right?
Exactly. No, that's been also for me as first as an ECB scholar, right, to see after all the fighting over monetary policy of the past decade, just within a very short time span, just the ECB taking out all the stops, right, announcing this so-called pandemic emergency purchase program, right? Even the name had this sort of urgency, lending to all the member states in very large volumes, right? What we also discussed last week, and really acting in a way, obviously, very effectively. And then also what has gotten a lot less attention is how effective the Commission itself used the tools that they had, right? So first thing they put out of any discussion, the budgets, right? So the Stability and Growth Pact, all the rules for fiscal policies of the member states were just thrown out of the window, and I think that was a sensible move at that point. And then also, and this I already saw that Elena Horko is also here, with whom I wrote a very critical discussion of what's happened on the state aid level, right? So what the Commission immediately decided was to say, okay, member state firms need state aid at this point. This is an emergency. Every member state should be allowed to fund its companies as it sees fit. And there's a lot of legal wrangling going on, right? But basically the idea was, okay, we as a Commission are not going to stop any of the member states from supporting any of the firms that they deem in need of funding. And I think here again, action moves to the member state, right, where citizens can really critically look like, okay, do we really want to bail out those airline companies? Do we really want to support those firms that have not been paying taxes over the past years, right? And I think that's where that discussion should play out. But then we get to this topic of the single market, and that's where our criticism is, okay, given where member states are at the moment, given how unequal the impact of the crisis has been, given how limited the fiscal space, the ability to really support firms is between member states, there's a real risk that this will increase further already existing inequalities, right? So at the moment, half of all the state aid that's been applied for with the European Commission is for German firms, right? And then you can already see Lufthansa coming out of this crisis, shining, completely funded with billions from the German government, but other member states losing their airline company, and that further increasing already existing inequalities, right? And there, I think you see you need a more EU level response.
But moving back to the I'm bringing you back to the technocratic level. What would you like to say a bit more about what the ECB has been doing? Because I agree that most of the attention has been on that, but it is also true that they have implemented extremely quickly measures that 10 years ago would have been considered almost unthinkable, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's, I think, very clear, right? So like we've been fighting in Europe over member state debt now for decades, right? And then in the Eurozone crisis, it was sort of a game of chicken, right? Between, on the one hand, the ECB, on the other hand, the member states, right? So who is going to create a vehicle to solve this debt crisis? And both sides didn't want to do that, right? The ECB was like, look, this is not in our mandate. And the member states were also very hesitant, right? Nobody wanted to bail out the Greeks, right? So again, you see this dynamic of member state politicians, and then they were both waiting for the other to act, and that took almost 2 years, 2.5 years, right, until in the middle of 2012, Mario Draghi, whatever it takes. Also at the same time, the creation of the European Stability Mechanism, right, and this whole difficult fighting over, certainly in the Greek case, an unnecessary long financial market panic. Now, so none of that has happened now, right? So in some ways, I think everybody has learned a lesson from that, right? I think certainly the ECB, the response was like, okay, we're not going down that path. I think on Thursday, they're going to talk more about maybe expanding this program, right? And some of the solutions to the current problem might really come from the European Central Bank this time, right? That it's really just the European Central Bank. They come in, they start buying bonds on the market like crazy, and then member states can issue more bonds, right? And in that way, they will be able to support their individual economies, right? So there is some mechanism that might be a really important part of solving the current problems, right? The existing pandemic emergency purchase program of the ECB is also 750 billion in size, right? And if you would just scale that up further, that would be a way of solving this crisis. It would also be a very technocratic answer, right? And there I think you should really wonder, is this the right way to approach this? If this is a technocratic level, is that really where you should be making these kinds of decisions? And what kind of European Union do you have when all these really decisive decisions are no longer made by the member states, but rather by an entirely independent EU level institution?
Yeah, and a question that I have for you now would be about how we are framing, how you think people are still thinking about this crisis, right? Because a lot, people say a lot that this is a crisis that is different from the 2008 one, but still people are maybe mainly thinking about this with the glasses of the 2008, right? And I totally agree with you that from the central banking point of view, it was very interesting to see how what in the previous crisis took almost 5 years, right? So first you had the Trichet ECB, and then it took years for Mario Draghi to reach the whatever it takes in the summer of 2012. But at the same time, the previous crisis was something that was spilling over from a sphere to another sphere, and it was moving relatively slowly, right? So it started, of course, financially, and then it spread throughout banks, and then it spilled over to public budgets, and then it spilled over into political crisis, etc., etc. But what the lockdown means, and we are starting to see it with, I think, dramatic realism right now in the US, is how deciding that you're locking the economy down means stopping everything at the same time. So it means, bam, everything goes down in every single sector, whereas the previous crisis, a sector was affected and then the second one was affected, etc., etc. So the speed at which this thing is happening and is affecting people's lives is of course incredible. So do you think we are framing the way in which we think of this crisis in the wrong way?
Well, look, this is of course one of my favorite talking points. But yeah. So I think it's very important, if you move from one big crisis to a next crisis, that you're very aware that the tendency will be to import frames from that previous crisis to think about the current crisis, right? And I think in one regard, there are some important lessons learned from this crisis, right? So don't let financial market panics get out of hand. Also, I think a very deep sense that solving this crisis in a way that bails out the rich, but doesn't do anything for for normal citizens is completely untenable and will destabilize the political system even further, right? So there's some lessons to be learned there, but still, yeah, I think that's a very real risk, right? So there you had a problem that started in the banking system and then caused problems in the real economy, right? But here it's really the other way around. So there's a few sectors of the economy that have been really hit very hard, right? And that need very targeted support measures, right? Measures that really only these the member states themselves can develop and implement and get to the people who need this. But the challenge is now not the banking system, right? So I think if anything, so far the banks are only just responding to problems that are in the real economy. Now it might still happen, right? And I think what you said just now about the riots in the US, that is very, very worrying, right? So you saw a lot of the really political response play out over a number of years, right? But in the previous crisis, and now we're just really only at the beginning, right? So this is still a crisis that's going to continue. In the best case, the corona doesn't come back, but very likely it will come back in the autumn, right? Or other adaptations that have to be made, right? So the idea that this crisis will be over soon is, I think, optimistic case. And in any case, the economic impact will continue for a considerable amount of time. And yeah, and in many ways, I think it's really still unclear what's going to happen, but it's obviously going to be very different from the previous crisis.
Yeah, and also on this point, on the, again, and going back on the European level, I think that the real news, that the real novelty is, of course, this recovery plan that will be discussed, and we will see in what form and if it passes, right? Because this really would be moving away from the tools used in the previous crisis, because it would mean a fiscal counter shock coming from the EU level, right? And here, the way in which the technocratic and the democratic nature of the EU will interfere is also very interesting, right? Because it is all an open question right now.
Yeah. No, so that that is part of the solution that's now taking shape. So by itself, this fund is probably not enough support, right? So you saw just such a huge impact on the economy, even with what happened, right? And then certainly you would need more, right? So what I think is, first of all, interesting is this political move, that you see more emphasis on an EU level response and moving away a bit from the member state level. I think it's also something to worry, right? So there's also a clear economic policy dimension to this fund, right? So it's going to move in the direction of digitalization. It's going to move in the direction of greening the economy. They're very difficult political choices to make on both these fields, right? So in digitalization, there's all these concerns about privacy and concentration of so much power in the hands of a few tech companies. And then also in the green domain, you need to make all these choices about who is going to be impacted by the green transition, right? Poland already came up in the chat, right? Polish fossil fuel related industry will probably need to shift, right? Is it really a good idea to do that on the EU level? Probably not, right? If that's not a decision that's in some way also taken by Polish level politicians who explain this to people who are affected by it, I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, but it should also be said, I think, that while the fiscal space that each nation state has and will be using is something that will push the system towards a definitely not a convergence, right? The European level response would be a possible way to steer the system towards a greater convergence, which is the great unanswered question. Well, it was the big promise of the euro, and it is the great element on which the euro so far has not been able to deliver, right?
Yeah. No, yeah, okay, yeah. This is also something that I've been arguing, right? So, so one of the problems with the EU at the moment is just very unequal distribution of capital, of industries, right? A lot of really strong, high value added industries are concentrated in core countries, right? And then you see in Eastern Europe, a lot of companies owned by Western industries, right? So these people are working for foreign companies, and in Southern Europe, you see a lot of industry that's very labor intensive, that's very vulnerable to competition in the world market, right? And that's a sort of unstable situation. And yes, I think that's really something where you need also an EU answer to that, aimed at equalizing value added in regions, in a more equal distribution of capital. But I think in part you want that because once you have that, you also need to do less on the EU level, right? If you would have this much more equal distribution of a value added, then you wouldn't be going from crisis to crisis, which needs to be solved on the EU level every time, right? Then you can also hope that for most crises, individual member states really have the capacity to address them, right? What you now have is a single market that just adds to inequalities, right? So that necessarily builds up imbalances, that leads to debt burdens in one part, right? Where you don't have these sort of redistributive mechanisms, you also moved from crisis to crisis. So ideally, you would move to something that's more technocratic and addresses these real problems of the internal market, but also retains these sort of tough political choices on the member state level, right? That if you're closing an industry for climate reasons, then people can look to their politicians for making that decision, and some of the trade-offs are decided there.
Yeah, I will just end my part here by making an observation, and of course, if you want to reply to that, what I can tell you is that from the Italian point of view, for me, it has been very interesting to witness how, as you were saying, this kind of European level challenge of building towards a similar kind of technocratic, if we want, system, how strongly politicized it was. So the Italian government has used this sort of negotiating process within EU institutions, trying to shift the discussion towards a greater burden sharing system as one of the elements of, like, one of the legitimizing elements of the government itself. So there were a few days before Germany shifted its position, where it really seemed that the government was really risking a gigantic amount of political power and credibility on this challenge that they were playing. And of course, I think I do not know to what extent it was calculated risk, but it definitely was a very important risk, because that was an element on which you could call for some kind of unity of political forces within parliament on one hand, but also a unity of public opinion on the other hand, right? So the build up to this possible technocratic response is inherently political, and as you say, it happens on the national level first.
Yeah. No, I mean that's also, I mean, a risk we haven't talked about, right? But what happens a lot, blaming things on the EU level, where in the end of the day, all these decisions are taken by the member states, right? So there's not that much that the EU can do without support of the member states in some way. And I think, yeah, and I think there also maybe also as national democracies, you know, over time you learn to deal with this EU entity better, right? So not letting governments get away with blaming things on the EU level, not letting politicians get away with superficial answers on how they want to continue European cooperation, right? I think the Dutch government is currently really getting away with a vision of the EU where just everybody is to be blamed for not sticking to their budgets, and otherwise they're not really being anything that the Dutch government could help contributing to, right? So you'd hope that over time you develop as democratic citizens in all these member states to think like, okay, this is what the EU is, this is what you can expect from the EU, this is what you can expect from your national democracies, and I think that could work.
Thank you very much. I think I will pass the ball back to Christina, who will pick up the questions, because we already have
a lot of great questions coming in. Yes.
Christina, are you here?
Yeah, let me just help with the questions a little bit, if that's okay. I'll just read a couple that have come out. So first question by Sarah, agrees that the intergovernmental level is the most democratic one as we speak. However, the council is very intransparent and consists of lots of neoliberal representatives stemming from ditto governments. The Commission and the European Parliament are, in theory, the appropriate institutions to represent some kind of common European values and interests, if those exist at all, and you tell me. Could you reflect on the future, the European institutional framework, starting from the fact that public health, aid to the poor, green investments, and the rest require more rather than less European coordination, as this crisis has bluntly demonstrated? The Polish people in the room are of the opinion that all Poles should emigrate to the rest of the EU to solve the problem, plus in order for the ancient forest to flourish.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks. This is yeah. So I think we've talked a bit about these challenges already, right? That on the one hand, there are real problems that you need to solve on the European level. On the other hand, of course, what happens on the EU level is the product of what individual member states bring into negotiations. The negotiations, I think this is also a really important point you make, are very intransparent, right? So we see Dutch governments saying one thing, promoting something else on that level, and that's just a problem. And then yeah, migration, right? So that's, I mean, I think it was something we haven't talked about yet, but the vision of, you know, a more equal distribution of value added is also one of less migration, right? Where people, and look, I am someone who loves to migrate, right? I have migrated a lot, but a lot of people also want to live within, you know, 20 kilometers of their mother, and that should also be possible. I think a vision of the EU where a lot of imbalances are solved by people moving to the other side of the EU is very unpromising, also in light of the climate impact of air flight. Sarah.
Can I quickly respond?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, the letter was rather a joke. I mean, I'm Polish. I pretty much hate everything that Poland says. So I mean, I'm just in favor of eliminating the country altogether. But let's stick to the point. So when it comes to the intergovernmental discussion, sometimes it's put or shoved under the table like that's not important, but I do think it's quite important. And I think it's quite a struggle also for governments to find a way to strive to European values or interests together, because I mean, they don't really seem to succeed. I think the Commission, which is blamed for a lot in Europe, actually does quite a good job in trying to achieve that to some extent. And then you see that all proposals stemming from the Commission are watered down by those same governments, right? So that's a very weird dynamics, I think. And it also contributes to the fact that a lot of people think that what's coming out of Europe is either too weak or it's too all-encompassing, right? And it should be subordinated to the national level. So I think that the current dynamics are rather poisonous. I also don't think that the European Parliament is a very representative institution. I mean, most people have no idea who takes part, right, on behalf of their party or their country in the Parliament. And you won't solve that with the European election list. That's like nonsense for the elites, you know. So that's, I think, a very difficult question, because I do think that more intergovernmental cooperation is very much needed. And I'm thinking of solutions like trying to work more together on the parliamentary level. That doesn't happen that often because parliaments don't have that many means, but they do have some platforms like the COSAC, and you could try to, you know, parliaments actually have more power than they think, and I think they could really try to enhance their power, and this is the right moment to do it. I mean, that wouldn't solve all the problems, obviously, but I think they can manifest themselves more visibly, right? Like working together, and that's, well, maybe that's something you could reflect on if you see that also as a fruitful pathway, because I think parliaments are actually more willing to think of European goals and values than governments actually, because they're less under the lobby also of big pharma or big businesses. So I see a big.
I think that's probably the direction to look, right? So I think certainly the European Parliament has been very much removed from the discussions going on in the member states, right? So I think also with the discussions you had now in the Netherlands, it might have been very valuable to have some MEPs of the different parties coming in, giving their view. But that's of course the last thing that the domestic parliament factions want, right? So there's, I think there's certainly room for more involvement from EU level parliaments. I also think it's a bad idea to think of the European Parliament as in some way really replacing national parliaments, right? And this idea of you just get a parliament on the EU level that works in the same way as the national parliament, right? For the reasons I've already said, right? I think that's just not a realistic expectation. Now, yeah, I think there you'd want to see a bit more experimenting, right? So if we're really moving this in this hybrid direction where you retain a lot of things on the member state level, but on the other hand, also more budget on the EU level, right? Like a lot of the green transition is really going to happen on the EU level, not just this recovery fund, right? But also, for example, the green taxonomy going on at the moment, right? So the EU Commission is drafting a list of which business activities count as green. And this project has just boomed from this very small task of helping financial market investors deciding what counts as a green investment to really a framework that's now going to be used in all sorts of policy domains to decide, okay, this is green, this is not, and so really decide what people are doing. Now, these choices, I think that's important, and I think it's unavoidable that happens on the EU Commission, EU level. The Commission will be making those choices, but then you also want more and think more about what democratic mechanisms fit that sort of structure. And the European Parliament, I think, can't be the whole answer.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And we'll move to another question that we've got in the chat. It's from Ben, and I'll just read the question out. If we seem to be implicitly creating a dichotomy between a technocratic EU level and a democratic national level. And Sarah previously seemed to challenge this. What would this imply for the EU if democratically elected governments in member states, for example, Hungary, behave in ways that violate core EU principles?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, Ben, if you want to come in and respond to my question, don't hesitate to do that. Yeah, that's a very difficult question, right? But also there, I think, okay, there's one thing to observe is that the way in which Hungary is currently slotted into this internal market is not really conducive to strong rule of law, right? So on the one hand, Orban, of course, has been a massive beneficiary of the EU funds, which go into the Hungary in a quite intransparent way. On the other hand, a lot of young critical Hungarians have moved to the rest of Europe, right? Because that's where the jobs are. So I think also there, if you would have a more fair distribution of the benefits of the single market, I think already a lot of the problems of Hungary would be less. And then I also think, yeah, no, look, like you can't go in there and bring regime change, right? Or like use some EU procedure to force member states to improve these sort of things if they don't believe in rule of law, right? So I think in the end, yes, that sort of things have to happen on the level of the member states, right? You have to have citizens that really believe in rule of law. I saw this Article 7 procedure, right? And then the Commission, and they write an angry letter. I don't think that's the solution. I don't think there's a really elegant solution to this, right? Now imagine a member state, I mean, in the end, Hungary, right? It's still some ways a democratic country, a country slipping away even further into an illiberal, undemocratic direction. I don't think there's an EU level answer to that. I wouldn't know what that would look like.
But I like also another aspect of Ben's question, because Ben is also challenging you on one of the premises of your discourse here, right? So you are sort of saying, look, the EU works as a technocratic structure, and then you have national governments that are truly democratic. But it is also true that there is a level of representativeness of each European institution, apart from the ECB, of course.
Yeah.
So I think that Ben is also trying to push you a little bit in sort of problematizing this premise you have started from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a descriptive premise in a way, right? It's first of all just a vision of how the EU could function. And I think that fits better with how the EU currently function than a model where you say we move democracy to the EU level, right? And then I also think, yes, it's true that this is a sort of stark opposition probably, and there is the European Parliament. And I think that's a discussion also just now with Sarah already brought out, right? You also want to bring in more democratic things on the EU level. You probably also want to consider more technocratic elements on the member state level, right? So certainly, if you move to a solution to public debt levels where you say, okay, we don't want any debt crises anymore. We want to end this whole story where, Italy now is paying 2% more interest rate than on its debt than Germany. And I think that's really just money basically you're throwing out of the window. Then probably you also want to have some more rule-based framework for how much debt member states issue, right? Now, I think I'm not afraid of that, right? I think that's a really important part of public finance to invest in the future. But yeah, you would also think about more technocratic things on the member state level. So, okay, so I don't want to be too dichotomous about that. Do you think that responds to Ben's concern? Otherwise, Ben should just raise his own question more forcefully.
By all means, if you want to come in, Ben, you're more than welcome to.
Thanks, that's very kind. No, I mean, I feel you guys have touched on the key. Jens, you responded. I like your response. I think Rafaela correctly brought out the degree to which I myself have questions what precisely we mean by the word technocratic here. Is that meant to delegitimize some body or way of thought? I'd be curious to know more what you mean to capture or exclude by using the term, but I don't mean to sort of sidetrack the conversation into my own eddies of interest here. So,
yeah. Well, okay. So this is also maybe a bit in the background, right? So I certainly don't want to use technocratic in a pejorative sense, right? And actually, 2 weeks ago, Benjamin Brown published, I thought was a very interesting article in which he says something like, okay, maybe some of these technocratic institutions currently aren't working ideally, certainly from a progressive perspective, but if you give these institutions a more progressive mandate, a more progressive task, then they might also pursue other more desirable goals. And given the complexity of the sort of society we have, of course you need an immense amount of technocracy to really effectively govern some of these things. And I think that's what all this looking at central banks has made me more at ease with, right? So I think there are strengths and weaknesses of technocracy, and we should really think about how to slot that into a democracy rather than opposing it or favoring it altogether. But I think at the moment we might not have all the answers.
Do you want to come back with something, or should we move on?
No, I'm very satisfied. Thank you very much.
That's cool.
Thank you.
So if I may just pick up on that last thread, Jens, one of the queries that I have is, if we just backtrack prior recovery fund and prior PEEP, we had Italy threatening to basically detonate the whole European project while Cuba and China sent medical supplies before anyone else. And while Lagarde said that we're not here to close the spreads, right? So in fact, the precariousness of the European project just really came to the fore. And in fact, what seemed to sort of placate the whole mess was the PEEP, which has now been somehow questioned in the Constitutional Court of Germany, and also this recovery fund, which is peanuts, right? And I was just wondering how sort of plaster-aid you see these kinds of responses, because I'm thinking in the long view, if you were to be a historian of the future and look back at the EU, say the EU disintegrates, and you look at, oh, what were the things that wedged into that crack? Oh, the European debt crisis. Oh, the refugee crisis. Oh, Orban staying on for a perpetual term. Oh, the lack of solidarity in COVID. I mean, you could read the whole situation as just being sort of another little thing that kind of leaves those cracks gapingly open as time progresses, as opposed to there being any kind of mending whatsoever of the cracks that were so obviously revealed. So I'm kind of thinking, you seem to have this, it's more of a question, like you seem to have this sort of optimistic take on, all we need is just more, cooperation. And it's like, okay, sure, but the reality sort of seems to show otherwise.
Yeah, well, I think I started off by sort of observing something also about the precariousness of this whole institution, right? So this is a very good question. Thank you for pushing me on this. So I think that's first just starting off from this precariousness, right? That you have these member states where things have to be decided and where you have all these veto players, and then an EU level that can't really solve some of the problems. And then I think what you've said, I think that's absolutely spot on, right? So I don't want to give the impression that I don't think there are really existential risks for the EU, right? I think that's really the case. And that has also, I think, shaped some of the discussions, right? So this is very clear in Germany at the moment that Merkel, Wolfgang Schäuble, but I think broadly the German political system takes this existential risk very, very seriously, right? And rightly so. Right? Germany benefits massively from how the EU currently works. I also think there is a real existential risk. What you already said about solidarity, and then what I think over time, if we look back in 20 years, might think was really decisive is a further growing of economic divergence between the member states, right? So already from the start of the EU, start of the euro, these divergences have been growing, and at some point you reach a point where I don't think the EU is a viable project anymore, in the sense of that there's really the equality between the member states that you need to make it work. I think that's also very difficult to say how that develops, right? So I always, when you talk with people who vaguely consciously experience the end of the Berlin Wall, they always say, well, look, a month before I was seen as, completely crazy for thinking it could happen in 10 years. And yeah, that to really say whether something so dramatic would happen, I think nobody knows that, but I think it's a very serious risk. And probably if it would happen in half a year from now, we wouldn't know that better or anticipate that better than we're currently anticipating it, right? I don't think there's any reason to think we would see something coming, because it will be kind of chain reactions, and suddenly one member state decides to leave and the whole thing collapses. So thank you for pushing me, because yeah, I think that is a real risk. You have a probability estimate of it? That me.
If I can just add can you hear me?
Yes.
If I can just add a really kind of a footnote to this, I definitely agree with you, Christina, but I also think that something that was interesting of these months is how this threat has become real and clearly perceivable throughout Europe. So, like, for example, when Christine Lagarde made that comment about we are not here to close interest rates, which was very unfortunate, but that was a very it was a tipping point, at least from my point of view, because, for example, in Italy, there was immediately a statement coming from the president of the Italian Republic, who's like the figure who represents the unity of the state. It is a figure that is not that does not have a party affiliation, and it really is a sort of an apolitical head of state. Immediately, very quickly after that comment, there was a very stark statement coming from that institution that was representing the national interest, basically, and through representing national interest was raising the bar for the European response, right? So this is something that it really was a sort of an open wound, and it was clear for everyone to see what kind of game was at play. And at the same time, I think that also all of this discussion towards a further burden sharing is, of course, also reflecting back on the national level, and at least in Italy, it is taking arguments away from Eurosceptical forces, because before, of course, you could say, look, nobody is doing anything for addressing all of these divergence. But of course, while this negotiation is developing, and it looks like we really are going towards that direction, all of the Eurosceptical forces have a lot of arguments less, and there are also polls that suggest that their grasp on public opinion is declining. So there are all of these things at play, and I think they are all feeding into the EU level discussion.
So maybe just complement that. Oh no, please, Christina.
Because we've come up to time and we don't have any more questions, what we could just do is, if you want to wrap up with some final closing remarks, and then yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, maybe let me then just only briefly complement what Raf already said with the Dutch perspective, right? So I think that's already very interesting to talk about all these messy member state level processes, right? And in some ways, Dutch and Italians are maybe the most extreme examples of tendencies that exist in most member states. And then, yeah, so initially it was really like, okay, no money, right? We're not going to pay for the lazy Italians because they are just going to spend it on, I don't know. And then I think that's still the majority view. And at the same time, you see the discussion becoming more nuanced, right? So more views coming in. I think this has happened much quicker in Germany, but the idea that, you know, there are some things that you want to improve about the EU, that if you don't have something of a common response, that won't bring this project forward and really has existential risk for the project, is sort of working, right? And then you can also get very weird coalitions, right? So on the one hand, there's sort of a center-left contingent that thinks that. On the other hand, of course, the big employers organizations, right? They don't want to give up on the EU. They love the EU, right? So then you get what you'd expect in a democracy, where people weigh a bit more different aspects, and you slowly develop a view that is more sensible. And yeah, that's democracy, right? It's a really slow, messy process, but I think we're now only at the beginning of that, and I think it's moving in the right direction. That's my optimistic note, Christina, to end on.
That's brilliant. I don't know, Raf, do you want to wrap up with anything?
No, I would just wrap up by thanking Jens, thanking you, and thanking Nikki for all the help in organizing this. And thanks everyone, of course, for tuning in and for listening and for participating to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks again to everybody. And please keep abreast of our upcoming events. We'll be posting them soon on our website and on the Twitter. So thanks Jens, thanks Raf, Nikki, everybody.